Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, the final stages of polishing a Japanese style blade. Quick video today. I'll be showing the final stages of polishing a Tamahagane blade. A couple months ago, I had a client helping me out with a smelt at my shop. Now, I was showing him a couple of blades that were hanging on some nails in my shop, and one of them was the very first blade that I ever made from Tamahagane. Tamahagane, if you're new to this stuff, that's the self-smelted Japanese type steel. Basically, steel made from dirt. Now, he said he was interested in buying the blade, and it had been hanging there for close to 15 years, just getting covered with grime. It's got a special place in my heart as the first blade of that kind that I ever made, but otherwise it was just kind of hanging there. So I decided to let it go, and now the blade's his. But as you might expect, after hanging there for a decade and a half, it was a little the worse for wear. So some repolishing was in order. Amazingly, the blade wasn't really in all that bad shape. You know, I'd kept it oiled and didn't handle it much, so there were a few scratches, but not too much rust. I did some spiffing up with 1500 grit sandpaper. I've got a whole rig that I use to do that. I'm not going to be showing that here. And then I moved on from there to the final stage of polishing that I use in my sort of hybrid polishing method. It's more or less an etching type process. Very different from the traditional Japanese approach. So that's what I'm going to show you here. I'm using lemon juice as my etchant. There's nothing special about it, squeezed right here in my kitchen. So here's the basic process. The idea of etching is just to bring out all the little facets in the microstructure of the steel. In traditional Japanese polishing, the final stages are done with very, very, very fine abrasives, little natural stones. We're not doing that here. I should have taken a picture before I got started on this, but I forgot to. So this is where it is right now. So here's the basic process. I'll start by degreasing the blade completely. Good old Palmolive dish soap. Rinsed in hot water so that when I dry it off, all of the water immediately evaporates. At this point, the blade is shiny and the hamon and the grain of the steel is not very evident. So I'll just use a tiny piece of paper towel to apply lemon juice to the blade, just scrubbing it back and forth. The idea is that instead of immersing it in something, I'm actually scrubbing the whole time so that I'm constantly removing oxides, exposing the steel to more acid. The citric acid is extremely mild, so if you just let it sit there, it won't etch very quickly, unlike, say, ferric chloride, which is much, much more aggressive. Incidentally, if you're curious why I wouldn't be using ferric chloride, ferric just will get into the little tiny nooks and crannies that are produced by forge welding tons and tons of times like you do with traditional Tamahagane-based steel. It'll eat holes into it. That ferric's likely to stick in those holes and just wreck the thing. So you really don't want to be using really aggressive etchants like that. Anyway, once the steel starts to turn a little gray and some pattern starts to appear, I'll wash off all the lemon juice. I want to be really, really thorough about this. Again, using hot water followed by very thorough drying. The next step is to strip off all the oxides that I just caused and bring it back to bare metal again using a metal polish. In this case, I'm using Mother's aluminum polish. This is made for polishing mag wheels. I've tried tons of polishes, and this is the one I like best. It doesn't have harsh abrasives like, say, flits, and the chemicals are relatively mild, leaving a fairly contrasty surface. Some of the more chemically aggressive polishes leave a much brighter, less contrasty finish, and I don't want that either. So now it's back to the lemon juice. This same process is repeated over and over until I get the effect I'm looking for. There are some other techniques I use in other types of blades. It really depends on the type of steel. Modern mono steels respond differently to Tamahagane, and then that's different from Damascus steels. Plus, different effects require different approaches. Some hamons are kind of misty, some are real bright and contrasty. You really have to kind of key it off the results that you're getting from the specific steel and the specific blade that you're using. I wish I could give you just a shrink wrap recipe, but really a lot of this is just experience. You have to try it over and over and see what works for you. Incidentally, if you're interested in learning about my hybrid polishing techniques, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where I've got a much longer video about my entire approach to polishing Japanese style blades, as well as Western style blades with hamons. That'll give you some of the other little tricks that I use on different kinds of blades. So usually I repeat the process, alternating lemon juice and polishing compound for 2 or 3 hours. Once I've cycled through all this and have the blade nice and clean, I'll use some baking soda to neutralize any acids that are still clinging to the blade. As I alluded earlier, Tamahagane blades have microscopic voids on all the weld lines. This is just a natural part of the huge amount of forge welding that's involved to get the final blade. If you let water, sugar, acids, any of that hide inside these tiny little voids, eventually you'll get rust. So baking soda will stop those acids from screwing up your blade. Then it's another really thorough hot water wash and rinse, followed immediately by thorough oiling. If you haven't experienced this, it is truly amazing how fast a freshly polished blade can rust if you don't get it oiled right away. And here's what the blade looks like when I'm done. Interesting story about this blade. As you can see, there's not a simple crisp hamon line, but rather all sorts of little clouds and blobs of hardened steel. This is what's known in Japan as a hitatsura hamon. As most of you probably know, hamons are typically formed by coating the blade with clay prior to quenching. Where there's clay, the blade cools slowly and the blade fails to harden. Where the blade's exposed directly to water, the steel does harden. And the hamon's just a visual representation of the structural difference in the steel between the hard portion, which is martensitic, and the soft part, which is formed by austenite. Not the case here. The interesting thing about this blade is that it was water quenched without one shred of clay. So why did it form a hamon at all? Well, first, you have to understand that traditionally made Tamahagane has 0 manganese. Virtually all modern steels contain manganese, and manganese promotes hardening, so that sort of shifts the hardenability over a little bit and makes all modern steels more hardenable than a traditional Tamahagane-based steel. Here, that lack of manganese allows the thicker part of the blade to retain enough heat during the quench that it didn't harden in those thicker sections. A second point is that the steel is probably relatively low in carbon. If I were to guess, it's maybe 0.6% carbon, and again, that's going to contribute to relatively low hardenability. Now, if you've ever photographed blades, you'll know that they're kind of tricky to photograph in the first place. But the polish that I got on this particular blade is actually one of the hardest blades to photograph that I have ever done. The hamon just didn't pop the way that hamons do on most blades, instead retaining this misty, spectral sort of look. If I tried to duplicate this 100 times, I would probably never get anything close to the same result. This is one of the features of Japanese swords that makes them so fascinating. Unlike a factory-made blade, every one of them is unique. As a maker, this is the most challenging, interesting, and frankly, scariest thing about them. You just never know how they'll turn out. Or, for that matter, if they'll turn out at all. Hope you enjoyed that, guys. Keep making those knives, and see you soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.